We need to identify objects. We need to identify physical objects that are generating data, because we need to know where the data is coming from. And then we also need to identify software.
What we're looking for here is interoperability, not alignment. And this is very, very important.
Welcome to Trade Treasury Payments, the podcast unlocking the future of cross-border finance.
From transaction banking and money movements
to liquidity, treasury, and cash management.
We bring you expert insights and the latest trends shaping global finance.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trade Treasury Payments podcast. I'm Carter Hoffman, the Trade Technology Editor here at TTP. In today's episode, we're going to dive into one of the less visible, but no less critical aspects of digital trade, which is trust. And as the industry moves increasingly from paper documents to digital data flows, the question about how that information moves and how it can be relied on across borders becomes more and more important. And at the center of that is this idea of trust. And that brings us to the world of identity management and, of course, trust services and the legal and technical frameworks that underpin them. So, to help us unpack all of this, I'm really excited to be joined by two experts that have been closely involved in shaping this field and really driving that forward. So I'm really happy to be joined today by Luca Castellani and Adam Cooper, who are going to help talk us through some of the aspects of trust, particularly when it comes to the idea of digital trade. Adam, Luca, welcome to Trade Treasury Payments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll start off just a quick round of introductions. So I'll just have you both introduce yourselves. So Adam, why don't we start with you? Maybe just who are you, where are you from, and what do you do?
Thank you. So just briefly, I'm Adam Cooper. I'm an independent consultant. I specialize in digital identity, in digital government, and digital transformation. I've spent a lot of time working in the UK government in the past, which is where I first met Luca, because at the time I was representative to UNCITRAL. But I was also spending a lot of time working with the World Bank and the European Union, largely because I was responsible for identity standards in the UK at the time. And they crossed over with a lot of the work I was doing. Since leaving the UK government around about 2018, I've been an independent consultant, but I mostly work in the developing world with the World Bank, although I do some private sector work as well. So I spend a lot of time working with other governments, helping them to implement ID systems, and hopefully getting them to follow many of the ideas and the specifications we put together back when I was working with UNCITRAL and with others like the European Union.
Thank you. Luca?
Luca Castellani. I'm an Italian, now living in Vienna, Austria, where I've been living for a while. Been working for 25 years with the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs, most of the time with the Secretariat of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, or UNCITRAL, which I left just at the end of January. And while I was with UNCITRAL, I was a secretary of the working group that drafted first the Model Law on Electronic Transfer Records, or NOETA, and then the Model Law on the use of and cross-border recognition of identity management and trust services, MLIT. And I recently published a book in the UK, actually, called UNCITRAL Model Laws on Digital Trade, where both model laws are discussed and their implementation, and also, of course, some related issues.
Awesome. Thank you both. So again, one of the things that we're hoping to talk about here is kind of that idea of trust in digital trade. So I guess, Luca, I'll come to you to start. So why does digital trade ultimately depend on trust in data more so than just perhaps trust in institutions, as we might, traditionally think when it comes to cross-border commerce?
Well, as long as we can remember, there's been the internet and there's been the famous cartoon about nobody knows that you're a dog in the internet. And so basically the problem is that distance does not help interaction. I think, however, that we have to go way past that cartoon, because that was about identifying humans as the people that they prefer to be or someone else. And today we live in a much more complex ecosystem. Most of my work is on digital trade, but it does not have to be limited to commercial interaction. So we need to identify individuals, of course, and that also has some important effects on privacy and other issues. We have, especially in trade, we have to identify in a manner which is reliable and consistent legal persons, because a lot of trade is carried out by legal entities, corporations, and the like. And then, this is something that I really believe in, and I think that over the years, this has become more and more evident. We need to identify objects. We need to identify physical objects that are generating data, because we need to know where the data is coming from. And then we also need to identify software. And now we see that with agentic AI, where we really need to find out who did what when in order to understand if something went wrong, what went wrong. Now, when we say trust, identification is a big part of it. It's not the only thing. Identification is about who originated information in electronic form. You may have also some other data quality which is relevant, like integrity, like time. So you have the notion of trust service, which is defined exactly as a service that provides a certain assurance on data quality. And that's why you put together identity management on the one hand and trust services on the other hand. But a lot of trust services have the identity component.
Awesome. Thanks, Luca. Yeah. So when you hear, I guess, all of the ways that it's important for cross-border trade, kind of makes you think of kind of the flip side, the what can go wrong, I suppose, when things go that way. So Adam, I guess coming over to you, where do you see trust most often breaking down when it comes to some of these cross-border trade transactions? And I guess the flip side of that is what can people do to help prevent that from happening?
Yeah, so one of the big problems is verification. So if you imagine in every country and within every country, within different regimes, from a legal perspective, there are different ways of identifying those entities that Luca was referring to. So identifying me as a human, but also identifying objects. So if we want to identify a physical object or a company as an entity, there are different ways of doing that in different countries. And it's how you get equivalence or understanding when you go cross-border is the big problem. So in the UK, we have Companies House that registers companies, for example. They now go through a process of, I have to prove my identity as an individual. So within that regime, we have my personal identity, but also the company's identity. Now, if we then move that and say I'm shipping something to, or I'm trading with Vietnam, their processes are going to be different. So it's how you get understanding between those different entities at either end of the equation of that transaction, or that whether you're shipping or selling or buying or whatever you might be doing. You need some understanding that this is what I mean by the proof of identity for me or that company in the UK compared to what I understand it to be in the destination country. And that's not a technical problem necessarily, but it requires technology to allow us to transmit that information, if you like, from A to B so that it can be understood. So there are lots of different layers to this. But primarily, it's sort of the first problem is, do you understand what a company means in this regime compared to that regime, and do we trust it?
So I guess you kind of touched on two different things there that I kind of want to dive down into a little bit more. There's the idea of verification and the idea of trust.
Yeah.
Right? So of course, just verifying that someone is a certain entity doesn't necessarily mean that you would trust them per se. So I guess
yes. Yeah, this is very true.
Mm-hmm. But
So
I guess my question there is, from your perspective, like what's that difference between verification and trust when it comes to some of these transactions?
This is a very good point. So it's useful to know that I am Adam and I am a UK citizen, perhaps. But you probably want to know more than that. You probably want to know, am I a responsible officer for a particular company? So am I able to transact on its behalf, for example? To be able to do that, there needs to be a relationship somewhere. In the case of the example I gave before, where you have Companies House in the UK, which relates me to my company. But it also has information about what I can and can't do. So am I in control of that company? Am I a director, for example? That trusted information also is part of cross-border trade, because you might need to know that I am actually authorized to be able to complete that transaction. So you can only do that if you've also got access to not just identity data, but also information about myself, but also my company. So there's also lots of other trusted data in the equation here, which is partly identity related, but partly also just comes from a trusted, or as I would call it, an authoritative source. Now, we also need to have trust around that, because those authoritative sources need to be trusted themselves. So you can't just take on face value that this is a company register in a particular country. You need to know that that is actually operated by or on behalf of a government, perhaps. So there's lots of different layers of information that need to be provided to be able to get a trust chain that allows you to then trust that this is a real company, I'm a real director, I'm actually authorized to complete the task I'm doing, so that you can trust it at the other end. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's more. This is way more than just identity. This is trusted data about the entities as well, and the relationships between them.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And Luca, I want to come back to you. So you mentioned in your introduction some of the work that you did on the UNCITRAL MLIT. So I'm just going to read the title of that out again, and then I'll have you break it down a little bit, because I know that title can be a bit of a mouthful. So it's the UNCITRAL Model Law on the Use and Cross-Border Recognition of Identity Management and Trust Services. So can you, I guess, explain what exactly that means, and I guess why and what I guess what and what it will be used for as well?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to suggest to someone the outline of a doctoral dissertation. Now, this is not going to be any easy. First of all, I have to say, this is not a fully original model law. It has been, of course, inspired and is in line with other UNCITRAL texts, starting from the Model Law on Electronic Commerce, 1996, which has a short title, but in terms is not really about electronic commerce. It's about electronic transactions and electronic contract. But leaving that aside, there is the EU model, the EIDAS regulation, which is a regulation exactly on electronic identity and trust services, which has been first adopted around 2014 and then recently reviewed. So that one is the first piece of legislation that has conceptualized the two issues of identity management and trust services. Now, in the opinion of some, while there is, of course, an identity element in trust services, the two are not necessarily the same, because in particular, if we look at physical persons, identity management has something to do also with national security and the like, while trust services is really about commercial use or anyway, something that is, of course, important, but that is not as important and as sensitive as identity of human beings, which has also important implications in terms of which entity in government should be responsible, and in terms of the flexibility of the solutions. Because the more we want to cater to the market, the more we have to give a range of solutions. And the more we go towards, of course, interoperability and technology neutrality. So you have on the one hand identity management, which in EIDAS and in the UNCITRAL Model Law applies only to persons, physical and legal. And on the other hand, you have the trust services, which applies to everything, and it's just data quality assurance. or it's a lot, but it's data quality assurance. Now, the use, of course, it means the use at the national level, or in the case of the European Union, at the union level, because there is a single market of some sort for that, or anyway, there is a harmonization. The cross-border recognition is the difficult part, because there's different technical standards. People always speak about passports, and now we have biometric passports, and in many cases, we can use the biometric passport to use through these, automated gates and the like. I think that's oversimplifying the issue, because there is, of course, an ICAO standard behind, but there is also more, and passports in themselves are definitely not a very trustworthy credential for human beings, because a lot of the passports are forged or misused. And when I say a lot, I mean it means in a statistically very significant way. So while here we have to have much less tolerance for mistake or for fraud, and therefore we need to find systems that currently do not really exist for the cross-border recognition, on the one hand, of identity management, and that's very difficult in its own way, and on the other hand, of trust services, which is also difficult, but in a way maybe is easier, because we have a very, very big use case for that. And I would like just to say this: an electronic signature is also a trust service in EU legislation and in UNCITRAL Model Law. But how many electronic signatures are exchanged across borders every day? Millions of different types. It's not necessarily in the form of a formal signature. Of this will be like very few, actually. But many of them are implied. But even every time we send an email across borders, that email is signed and there is some sort of electronic signature. I'm not saying it's a reliable electronic signature. I'm not saying it's a particularly complex or technically advanced electronic signature. But we have all of these millions of signatures being exchanged, and there's very few problems and very few legal challenges to that. Partly because, for instance, let's think of all the messages that are signed and exchanged in systems like SWIFT. SWIFT is cross-border, and it's money. I mean, especially here, we know SWIFT very well. And all of these messages are signed by someone. It's a messaging system. There's millions of messages only in SWIFT exchanged every day. And then there is no legal problem, because the rule book gives a contractual framework for the legal recognition. But we have to go a little bit beyond these systems, and have some solution that underpins a global digital trade ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And how does that model law interact with countries that have strong national identity systems, like, for example, India? How does that look in practice?
There's basically two solutions that are combined there, and this is the only way that so far we can move forward. There's the possibility to have the determination of the reliability of the trust service before the use, but it's very time consuming. You have that also in the European Union. You have that every time that you say you have some sort of accredited service provider or something like that. And then, and very importantly, there is the possibility to prove, in fact, the reliability after the use. And that means that all kind of signatures and our trust services are allowed by the law, and that the parties to the actual exchange may decide which technology and which solution is best for their needs in light of a number of circumstances. And the possibility to go to court and to prove something is already a game changer, because this opens up to all kinds of solutions and to all kinds of technologies. Although we see very, very little litigation in this field, but there is always the possibility of repudiation, especially when a law is technology specific. But you mentioned India. India is not technology specific. The first law on electronic signature a while ago was technology specific, but after a few years that was changed, and it was changed in this kind of solution, which we call the two-tier. So you can do it before or you can do it after. And this is also in line with all the different trade agreements, including the JSI stabilized tests on the e-commerce, because they both are technology neutral and they favor the use for kind of methods and systems and products. Therefore, it is, let's say, the prevailing trend, and I think this is quite the right direction.
Awesome, thanks, Luca. So, Adam, I want to come to you, and I want to ask, kind of on the actual implementation side when it comes to MLIT and how it's used, like I suppose at like systems and architecture level in some of these tech systems that are being used. How, I guess, what impact would this new law or would the model law have on the actual way that businesses are able to use it kind of in practice day to day?
Hey, enjoying this podcast? Hit that follow button for more. Done? Let's get back to it.
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I don't really look at it as impact being the key word there, really. I mean, one of the key things about this is we're trying to get cross-border interoperability. So the idea is to gain an understanding of what is being done, as I said at the beginning, in each country. And one of the concepts that we have in many of these things is levels of trust, so levels of assurance. Now, Luca mentioned the latest EU version of EIDAS. That has now decided that it's going to go just for level high. So they've set in their trust framework that everything has to be at the highest level of trust. So that's the equivalent of qualified electronic signatures and the kind of level you have to go to there to prove who people are and who entities are. That's not always the case. So in the first version of EIDAS, and certainly in many other parts of the world, not everybody gets to high. So what you need to have are defined levels of assurance in the trust framework, defined in the model law, for example, that allow us to understand levels of trust. So you can have high as the highest level, but you will probably also need what we used to call substantial and possibly low as well. And that allows you to then understand that if from my country, I assert that I am who I claim to be, and my company is who it claims to be, you know at what level of trust that is at, so you can understand it. And those are all described as outcomes. They're not described as technologies. And the reason why we do that is because every country does identity differently. So there is not one, there really isn't just one country that does it the same as another. Across the whole of Europe, they all do it differently. And for good reason, because they've got they might have ID card schemes, for example, or ID schemes that have been in place for decades. So you don't want to uproot all of that in the first place, because that's the functioning of that country. What we're looking for here is interoperability, not alignment. And this is very, very important. So EIDAS, for example, is very careful to make sure that sovereignty is maintained for each of those countries that are involved in that trust framework, so that they're able to do what they do nationally as long as they want to. But when that identity or that data is used cross-border, then they need to provide some metadata that lets us understand what kind of tests have been completed to prove that this is who somebody claims to be, for example. And then the receiver of that data can understand how they're going to treat that. Because in all of these cases, a large part of these transactions is actually risk-based. So you have to understand the risk of transacting with that entity with that level of trust and that type of relationship with that company performing that particular task. All those add up to how much you trust what's about to happen. It's not a green light or a red light. It's a lots of greys in between. And that's very important, because if you don't appreciate that risk at what I call the relying party end, so the service that's sort of consuming all of that, or the entity that's consuming all of that, then there's going to be problems. And a lot of the trust frameworks are based like this, because it's very important that you understand what's going on and how things have been proven. So impact-wise, for a country, I need to go through a process of making sure that I declare that I am at a particular level of trust for certain things, so that when it's received at the other end, somebody can understand that. And that's why we have standards and trust frameworks and all of these things that people can then conform to.
Yeah, thank you. So, Luca, I want to come to you. I mean, of course, at the end of the day, like, it's the public sector is the one that a lot of these laws are put in place for. It's a lot of them that are driving a lot of the changes that happen on the ground. So I guess, what role does the public sector play in shaping, or I mean, a better word might even be disrupting, some of these trust services that we're putting in place?
You know, Carter, I don't know, and I'd love to hear also from Adam on this one, because yes, of course, there is a certain understanding, and it's cultural. It has to do with, of all the people, with Napoleon. Napoleon was the one who introduced, allegedly, or anyway promoted, the modern way of keeping civil records and vital statistics. And that's very centralized, and that's very controlled by the government. But what Adam was saying before is that on the one hand, you have identity as the ability to identify an entity with a sufficient level of certainty in a certain context. And so that means, for instance, the human being has like a name, a birth date, place of birth, and so on and so forth. But then, and especially when it comes to social and commercial transactions, and not necessarily transactions with government, you also have a lot of trust that is built out of relations. And this was something that was introduced a while ago by trying to differentiate foundational identity as something that is given to the entity, and transactional identity as something that is built up. So it's like, what I always say is, for instance, I may have a certain credit worthiness, and then my spouse may be using my credit card and may be purchasing things that I don't even know the name of. But as long as I pay at the end of the billing cycle, I am credit worthy, and I build my credit worthiness over decades. And therefore, there is a lot of expectation that I will continue to pay. And it's irrelevant at the end of the day who is buying, as long as the named person is paying. So, and if you think of that way, you understand why there are countries like Sweden, where actually the identity management system is built based on banks and the private sector. Because at the end of the day, you can get to the same end result by going through our ways. So it's a cultural problem, which is very felt in the UK, I have to say. It's also an infrastructural problem, because in a lot of developing countries, people simply don't have access to these civil records and vital statistics, and therefore it's impossible to issue reliable credentials. But you can still build something, for instance, based on a mobile phone, if that's what they have. That can be enough for identification. So public sector is important, but I would say, as always, half of the job that the public sector can do is not to step in an area that can be taken care of very well by the private sector.
Yeah, Adam, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, quite right, Luca. It varies very much across the globe. So you're right to pick out the UK. We're quite different to a lot of countries in that we don't have an identity register as such. If you want to prove my identity in the UK, you have to look at lots of different data sets. So I might have a driving license, I might have a passport, but or at least 13.5%, I think, of the country don't have either of those. I might have a relationship with banks and with finance companies. So I might have a mortgage for a house. I might, have a mobile phone contract. And you can triangulate all of these different things. And in fact, we did a piece of work over 10 years ago now when I was running the technology side of Verify, which was a UK digital identity at the time. And we came up with so many different methods and data sets that I think there were 20,000 plus different routes you could take to prove who you were, which is crazy. But just because there were so many different data sets, you could triangulate who you were. And we wrote the standards to be able to do that. And it worked really well. We found over time is that actually most people just end up using a government issued document like a passport or a driving license and don't bother with all those different routes because they don't need to. But there's often in society people who cannot do that. I always use my mother as an example of that. She's never driven. She doesn't have a passport. She doesn't do online banking. She doesn't have a smartphone. So she doesn't have credit cards. She's got no real footprint. So it's really hard to prove who she is. So in those circumstances, you need to maybe look for other methods. One thing that gets used in many countries is the idea of vouching, where you might have somebody in the community who knows that person really well, has maybe known them for like decades, and can vouch for the fact that they are who they claim to be. And we use that in the UK to a certain extent, but I see it used in many other countries as well, in the developing world in particular, because it's often the only way you can prove who people are. Because as Luca said, not every country has sort of saturation on civil registration. So it's very hard to go to a government data set and say, well, who are these people? But maybe they're village elder or somebody like that, or they're in the Philippines, they have bangarees, and with the bangare captain, can vouch for, I know this guy because I've known him all his life since he was a child. So all of these have to be taken into account, and each country will have its own standards, if you like, or processes for how you then prove who people are. What we need to do is to take those, as I mentioned before, is to have some sort of standardized way of mapping that so that when somebody in the Philippines has their identity proven, then somebody in Singapore can understand what that means, because they're totally different regimes. So it's many of the rules within that are laid down for identity proofing in common standards that we have. So NIST 863, for example, particularly Part A, is all about identity proofing. In my country, in the UK, we have GPG 45, Good Practice Guide 45, which does the same thing. In EIDAS, we created an implementing act that did similar things, but it was all about outcomes and the process you had to go through to prove who people were or entities are. And so you have to have that framework somewhere that's technology independent and almost process and data set independent. So it goes through the steps of you have to verify who the individuals are, starting with them presenting evidence of who they are and then proving that evidence and verifying it and all these kind of things. Whilst it's vastly complicated and different everywhere, there are examples of how we can standardize this, which is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it goes back to what you said earlier, where it's much more about interoperability rather than alignment when it comes to all those different standards. I guess my next question then would be, if you were advising, say, a policymaker or an industry group about, how to move forward with, implementing some kind of identity system per se, or maybe perhaps something different, like, what's the single decision that you would recommend they make now to improve some of their cross-border trust over, say, the next decade?
Well, certainly one of the things that's gathering a lot of momentum are digital wallets. And so in the past, many of the systems that were used to prove who entities and people were basically registries, the databases that often sat in governments, possibly in trusted organizations, and very centralized or siloed in effect. And there's a move away, or starting to be a move away, from having those silos, and those silos being more about issuing credentials and enabling entities to be able to manage their own key credentials. So like identity, for example, but also some of the richer data about individuals. So the company I work for what my educational history is, all these kind of things that might be useful when I'm doing things, when I'm transacting. And that's moving towards a more decentralized world. The trust model is slightly different in that we're moving away from there being registries where you go back to the registry to verify something. But instead of that, the registries issue credentials. So it's a slightly different way of doing things. And then entities hold those credentials so that they can share them on to other entities. So it's a slightly different model. It scales much better. And it's much more privacy protecting and has a lot more security elements to it, because we're not reliant on these silos anymore in that way. So anybody who's embarking on sort of implementing identity now, I would say seriously look at what's happening in that space, because it's exactly what the whole of the EU are doing right now. That's where they're moving towards for cross-border identity, and also for business wallets, which they're introducing as well, so for entities. But it's also happening across ASEAN. I know they're looking at that quite seriously now. They're looking at the capability of them to be able to do that, the ASEAN countries, so the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I'm having conversations with the African Union about cross-border use of ID and all these kind of things, particularly for international trade. The African free trade area, looking at this quite seriously. So that is the direction of travel at the moment. So yes, anybody who's starting off in this space, I would say don't try and create anything centralized. Think about being decentralized from this point onwards.
Awesome, good advice. Luca, anything to add to that?
I agree. It's important to keep it simple and keep it open. I would say keep an eye on the forthcoming developments. On the one hand, it is true that EIDAS 2 in the EU foresees with EU digital identity wallet. However, because this has to do with physical persons, the implementation seems to be quite complex, and one has to be a bit cautious. There could be easier solutions. Adam mentioned the business wallet. The business wallet is different from the EU digital identity wallet. The business wallet probably will be something much more flexible and much more usable. And then, of course, this can be matched with new concepts like electronic attestation of attributes. So that, for instance, you can have a business wallet, and you can have also an attestation on for instance, the powers of the physical person acting on behalf of the company. So that you know that that person has the ability to transact, for instance, to a certain amount, or to do everything, because this person is the person in charge. So that, I think that a lot of the developments will come from practical solutions, and a lot of the practical solutions will come from the private sector. And I believe that we see some very large companies, including from the US, stepping into the identity field. So let's not just look at the traditional solutions, especially small developing countries look at the electronic identity cards as something useful. Yes, they may be useful if they're managed well for certain very specific purposes, but definitely they are not the most important component of a digital trade ecosystem. They address certain specific issues. Again, physical persons are difficult to deal with because of privacy and other things. But if we look at trade, many other solutions can be much simpler to implement, and they can help us. And let's not forget, we didn't say one word, which is a magic word: identity, identification, and everything has to do with compliance. So all of this discussion, so far so good. We're talking about identity management, trust services, but at the end of the day, reliable, persistent, coherent application of these tools means easier and more thorough compliance.
Awesome. Thank you, Luca. Yeah. I mean, of course, compliance is one of the most important things there. But I know we are almost out of time here, so I do want to give you guys kind of a chance to give one final word. So I guess my last question, I'll come to Adam first, and then Luca, I'll give you a chance as well. But if there's one thing from this conversation that you want listeners to be able to walk away and remember in 6 months when they're thinking back to when they listen to it, what would that one core message be?
Okay, so I think for me, I think the one core message would be that one of the most important parts of all of this for me, is the trust framework, because it helps every entity that's involved in that ecosystem to understand their responsibility, but also the responsibility of the other entities, and to understand how trust is formed. And without that framework, it's very hard to understand how concepts like liability work, for example. So I think it's a very important place to start, is to have that understanding that you need some rules for how everybody interoperates.
Thanks, Luca. Same question over to you.
I do hope that this is just, an appetizer for people to go and look into things. As Adam said, the need for holistic vision. So any policy in this field, for instance, should be applied consistently and coherently across all government bodies. And of course, when there would be also something for private sector, but we see still some differences. For instance, even in the EU, where most work has been done, it's not that EI does do is completely aligned with PSD3 and stuff in payments, So even there, where you have all of that expertise and all of that experience, you still have discussions. So if it looks difficult, maybe it's not that it's so difficult in itself, it's just very complex. And so to appreciate this, one has to try to bring together all the different pieces of the puzzle and start, with some patience, putting that together when it will come.
Yeah, thank you. And as you said, hopefully this is just an appetizer for people that are listening, because I'm sure that we could continue having this conversation for several more hours. But no, at the end of the day, we've covered, the concepts of verification and trust, that idea of a trust framework, the ideas of decentralization over centralization, interoperability over alignment, but that really at the end of the day, it all comes back to that idea of compliance and really making sure that we're able to drive that home. So Adam, Luca, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thanks.
And don't forget to follow Trade Treasury Payments
on your favorite podcast platform.
Thanks for listening.